the year 37 AD. The Emperor Tiberius had died, and from the shadows of the palace came a young man, pale-faced, eyes sharp as glass. His name? Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but Rome would call him something else. Caligula, the Little Boot. The name began as a joke. When he was a child, he used to run through army camps wearing a tiny soldier's outfit and miniature boots. The soldiers adored him. But destiny had a darker sense of humor. That little boy would grow up to wear the biggest boots in the empire, those of a god. At first, Rome loved him. He was charming, young, generous. He freed political prisoners, lowered taxes, and threw lavish public feasts. For a brief moment, it felt like the golden age had returned. But something began to shift. The light in Caligula's eyes turned cold, like a storm gathering behind a smile.
One morning, Caligula stood before the Roman Senate. He raised his hand and said, "I am not merely emperor. I am a living god." The senators froze. In Rome, emperors could be honored as divine after death, but never while they lived. Caligula shattered that boundary. He ordered temples built in his image. Priests were commanded to offer sacrifices to him directly. Those who refused disappeared. Some said he even offered human sacrifices to prove that the empire itself bled at his command. Rome had worshipped Jupiter for centuries. Now Jupiter had a rival, and he wore a crown of gold and madness.
To Caligula, power wasn't politics, it was art. He treated the empire like a stage, and every act of cruelty was a performance. One night, he invited the senators to a grand banquet. The wine flowed, music played, until the guests noticed something strange. The men sitting beside them were not nobles, but convicted murderers, released by Caligula himself. When the senators realized, the room froze. Caligula laughed softly and said, "We are all criminals. I simply wear finer robes." Laughter filled the hall, but it was the sound of terror wearing a mask. Behind the spectacle was something darker. Caligula didn't seek pleasure for its own sake. He sought control over pleasure itself. His palace became a labyrinth of gold and flesh, where no love was genuine and no consent mattered. He took wives from husbands, sisters from brothers, and turned affection into a weapon. To Caligula, every body was a throne, every kiss a declaration of ownership. Desire wasn't weakness, it was a form of rule, the sweetest kind of tyranny.
One afternoon, Caligula entered the Colosseum. He looked at the roaring crowd and said quietly, "Let the lions eat something new today." Then he pointed, not at the gladiators, but at the spectators themselves. The gates opened, and beasts tore into the stands. Blood splashed over marble seats. The emperor sat smiling, not out of joy, but out of fascination, watching fear bloom in the eyes of his people like a flower of obedience. The historian Suetonius would later write, "Caligula killed as musicians play, with art and rhythm." But even gods grow paranoid. Caligula began to suspect everyone, his advisors, his generals, his own guards. In the winter of 41 AD, after a night of drunken celebration, he walked through a dim corridor in his palace. Behind him, his guards exchanged glances. Then,
Steel flashed. A dagger struck his ribs, then another, and another. Caligula collapsed in his own blood, smiling faintly. After Caligula's assassination, Rome trembled. Senators whispered about restoring the Republic, but it was too late for that. The empire had tasted godhood, and there was no turning back. The soldiers found Caligula's uncle, a quiet, stuttering scholar named Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. They dragged him out, terrified and shaking, and in a twist of irony, proclaimed him emperor. The empire had killed a monster, only to crown a ghost. At first, Claudius ruled wisely. He reformed the courts, expanded Rome's borders, and restored a sense of order. But beneath the marble calm, desire still pulsed through the palace halls, a whisper that no emperor could escape.
Her name was Valeria Messalina, the young wife of Emperor Claudius. Beautiful, intelligent, and dangerously bored. While Claudius spent his nights reading scrolls and debating history with senators, Messalina turned the imperial palace into her private theater of lust. She seduced nobles, gladiators, even slaves. But what began as pleasure became a declaration of power. In the empire's heart, desire was the new form of rebellion. Historians wrote that Messalina would sneak out at night, disguised as a common woman, to work in the brothels of Rome, not for money, but to feel what power felt like from the other side. She competed with the city's prostitutes, wrote Juvenal, and left them all in exhaustion. It was madness, but it was organized madness. The same disease that had infected Caligula, now wrapped in silk and perfume.
In 48 AD, Messalina's hunger went too far. While Claudius was away, she secretly married another man, a noble named Gaius Silius, as if the emperor himself no longer mattered. It was an open challenge, a coup dressed as a wedding. The palace guards stormed the ceremony. Messalina fled through the gardens, barefoot and crying, her jewels clinking like chains. When Claudius heard of her betrayal, he hesitated, torn between rage and love. But his advisors, fearing for their own lives, ordered her execution. Messalina was found hiding in a villa, and when the soldier hesitated to strike, she seized the dagger and ended it herself. She died as she lived, wrote Tacitus, unashamed. The empire buried her in silence, but the message was clear. In Rome, desire was not a sin, it was a weapon, and those who wielded it carelessly were destined to bleed.
Claudius remarried, and this time he chose not love, but strategy. His new wife was Agrippina the Younger, niece of Caligula, and mother to a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. The world would later know that boy as Nero. Agrippina was not Messalina. She didn't chase pleasure in the open. She controlled it, weaponized it. Every glance, every word was calculated. She ruled through whispers, through the gentle hand on the emperor's shoulder. Claudius believed he was marrying stability. What he brought into his home was ambition wrapped in elegance. A woman who wanted an empire for her son, and she would get it.
By 54 AD, Claudius had become inconvenient. He was old, cautious, and too fond of his own children. Agrippina wanted one thing only, to place Nero on the throne. So, one evening, a dinner was prepared in the imperial palace. Claudius's favorite dish,
mushrooms, sweet, fragrant, and this time laced with poison. The emperor's throat tightened, his eyes widened, and within minutes, the scholar who had survived Caligula's reign was dead, silenced by a meal from his wife's hands. Agrippina wept in public, but behind the tears was triumph. The next morning, the Praetorian Guard marched Nero through the golden gates of the palace. At just 16 years old, the boy became emperor. Rome had a new god, and this one would burn the world. At first, Nero was a vision of youth and promise. He played the lyre, wrote poetry, and spoke of peace and beauty. Rome adored him. They called him the artist emperor. But art, like power, can twist into obsession. As the months passed, Nero's performances grew stranger. He would sing for hours, forcing the senators to applaud until they fainted. No one dared to leave, because anyone caught exiting was executed for disrespecting divine art. Agrippina watched with growing unease. She had created a monster she could no longer control. When she tried to restrain him, Nero did the unthinkable. He ordered her death. The woman who had birthed an emperor was struck down by her own son's command. "Let her be killed," Nero said. "She wanted to rule Rome. Now let her meet the gods instead."
Then came the night of July 18, 64 AD. Flames erupted in the marketplace, and within hours, half of Rome was burning. People screamed that Nero had ordered it, that he wanted to rebuild the city as his personal paradise. And as the city burned, some said they saw him standing on a balcony, playing his lyre, singing of the fall of Troy. Maybe it's legend, maybe not, but the image endures. Nero, the artist, who turned tragedy into theater, who saw beauty even in destruction. To calm the outrage, he blamed a small new religious group, the Christians, and unleashed a reign of terror. They were crucified, burned alive, turned into human torches to light his gardens at night. Rome watched in silence, because by then, fear had become law. When news reached the city, the people didn't cheer. They stood in stunned silence. Rome had burned, its gods had fallen, and the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the bloodline of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, was no more. For the first time in over a century, the empire was without an emperor. The Senate declared the end of a lineage that had once seemed divine, but the poison of absolute power still flowed through the veins of Rome. The city rebuilt itself again, but the scars of those years never faded. Every palace, every marble statue carried the ghosts of emperors who believed themselves gods and learned too late that gods can bleed.
By 68 AD, Rome had had enough. The legions in Gaul and Spain revolted. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Even his Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to protect him, turned against him. He fled the city in disguise, with only a handful of loyal servants. For the first time, the emperor who claimed to be a god was just a man, terrified, hunted, alone. He reached a small villa outside Rome. As soldiers approached, Nero realized there would be no escape. He turned to his companions and asked, "Is there no one left to love me?" Silence. Then, as the sound of horses closed in, he took a dagger in trembling hands. Unable to strike himself,
He begged his servant to help. Together, they drove the blade into his throat. "Too late," he whispered. "This is loyalty." Those were his last words. The artist of Rome had ended his own play.
As the years passed, Nero's obsession with performance grew. He no longer wanted to rule. He wanted to be adored. He sang in public theaters, forcing nobles and soldiers alike to attend. No one was allowed to leave, not even to give birth or die, until Nero finished his performance. He raced chariots in the arena, played the lyre before thousands, and demanded thunderous applause after every note. But behind the stage lights and applause, his empire was dying. The treasury was empty. Rebellions flared in